Hi, my name's Richard Bardgett, and I'm Executive Editor for the Journal of Ecology. Each year, the editors of the Journal of Ecology have the honor of identifying an ecologist for our Eminent Ecologist series. And this year, I'm delighted to be talking today to this year's recipient, Katharine Suding, who's Distinguished Professor of Ecology at the University of Colorado. Katharine is widely acclaimed for her work on applying concepts in plant ecology to ecosystem management and restoration, and also biodiversity conservation. And she's worked across a broad range of ecosystems, but mainly in alpine, tundra, and the prairies. She was recipient of the Ecological Society of America's Robert MacArthur Award in 2018 for her contributions to ecology, and she is a regular contributor to the Journal of Ecology. So welcome, Katharine, and many congratulations on the award. Now, the first question I want to ask is a very sort of general question. It's quite an obvious one, and it's really how you actually got to where you are today. So I guess the question is really, when did you actually decide that you wanted to be an ecologist? And I guess, was it always something that you wanted to do?
Well, I grew up in Colorado, and I think my parents definitely influenced what I thought was kind of interesting and possible careers. So I was fortunate that my dad was a field geologist, actually, and so he worked, and every summer he would go out to the field, usually places like Nevada, really remote, actually pretty hot and dry. And he would spend time actually looking in old mines and collecting samples. Um, I actually never really got into geology per se working with him, but I would always go out in the field with him. And I loved those types of experiences. And I think that was the first thing that got me kind of realizing that this was actually a career, that you actually could do this as a profession. And so while he would go out and collect rocks, I would go out with him, but I would be more looking at plants and kind of the living organisms. And I remember checking out a really old book at the public library, probably when I was in middle school, about how to be a naturalist and all the things that you need to write down, and trying to follow that. So I think that was the first thing that kind of indicated that probably focusing on something like ecology. When I went to college, I actually was considering between majoring in biology or majoring in English or majoring in actually economics. So I was all over the place. But I think those early experiences made me really realize about the kind of the joy of research and the ideas about how creative you can be in science. And so ended up focusing on ecology there and doing a thesis actually on how ants disperse seeds and how the land use legacies might affect the wildflower abundance in New England. And that was, again, just really fun to do, and just really formative. So I think those were the things that kind of took me on that pathway.
Yeah, you mentioned that you worked there on ants and plants, but was there a time in your career or a particular time when you decided you wanted to focus on plant ecology?
Well, so I went to Williams College, which is a liberal arts school where they give you a pretty broad education, but not a very specific education on particular organisms. So I never took a taxonomy course, or those things just weren't available to me. So I really didn't necessarily decide about what specific organisms to study. And to be honest, I think I could probably study any organisms and I would be absolutely happy. But just because of that first experience, that I happened to work with an advisor that worked with plants, and he got me interested in plants, made it possible for me to think about applying to grad school, and the logical place there would be to work with plants, and it just kept on building from there. But absolutely, I think particularly in community ecology, that probably could have gone so many different directions and still would have really been interested in the science. I really like the conceptual framing that kind of does transfer very well from system to system, as well as from, different types of interactions and also different types of organisms. And so I think that was just that once you kind of build a track, it's probably easier to keep going down that path than changing up. But I'm envious at times. People that work more kind of network ecology. I'm envious definitely of aquatic community ecologists for sure.
Yeah.
And then even though I love soils, sometimes I'm very envious of systems that aren't soil based. So you could really deal with the kind of the resource dynamics a little bit differently and maybe easier than what we have to deal with in terrestrial plants and soils.
Yeah, well, they're highly complex and difficult things to work with, aren't they, really? I
They're
mean, going back to you mentioned you were at Williams College, and you also touched on people who influenced you at that time or before. And I just wondered if there are particular people who've really sort of shaped the work that you've done through your training and career more widely.
Absolutely. I can trace, there's so many mentors that I really do feel that really influenced me. Several at Williams, and particularly Professor Kai Lee, who actually was a physicist, but led the environmental studies program, and then actually went on to do more environmental work. Super, super important. And a lot of it is that you just know that those people are there to support you, to see that you have potential, and that they'll always be giving you advice, but also be kind of 100% supporter of things that you decide to do. And still, I still rely on that network and asking for advice, and because I think it is hard to navigate and decide what to do when, and what's best to try to achieve where you want to go. So absolutely. So yes, there are people as undergrad, certainly in graduate school. My advisor, Deborah Goldberg, I am absolutely 100% indebted to her. And I have to say that sometimes my graduate students will roll their eyes and say, I can't believe all the comments you give, or how you have focus on the writing and and I just smile because I know that I'm modeling a ton of that to what was, I just felt like it was so successful and just so critical to my development and how I see science, the important aspects of science kind of intersecting. And those are all from the people that work with me.
Yeah, I mean, and also places can inspire people. You talked about the work of your father, etc. And I noticed you mainly work in the alpine tundra, but also in sort of prairie grasslands. I wondered, why have you chosen to focus on those systems? Because you could work anywhere. You could work in forests. You could work in.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that you choose a system to work with, some because of it is a good system to ask the questions you want to ask, right? You can ask different types of questions in different systems. But I also think you should work in a system that you just love. It inspires you, right? And you're just keenly interested in it for whatever reasons. And so growing up, I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, and that's always kind of the systems, the Western United States systems keep bringing me back. So I went to school at actually University of Michigan, which is mostly, so looking for a field site in Michigan, mostly secondary forests, a little bit of wetlands. And I spent so much time trying to find a herbaceous system that I could work in. And none of that really, well, it was good for what I ended up doing, but I drove around. I really wanted to work in prairies, and I just feel like that's something that probably is. If you grow up in some systems, you just like them, and you just feel comfortable in them, and you just those are the ones that you really want to study. Nothing against forests, and I certainly love forests for, you know, to be in and to explore, but they never have been necessarily the ones that I've gravitated to in terms of really diving deep. So yeah, in Michigan, I actually found a prairie that was influenced by Lake Erie in Ohio, actually, to do my do my work.
Right.
And I would drive a couple hours to get to this prairie that only existed because of fire, and you know, so, but it was the place that I wanted to work. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can really relate to that, because I always think it's important to work in the places that inspire you, and I think that often relates to where you were brought up, the systems you've worked in the past, etc. And you can stray into other systems, but I do the same. I work in forests occasionally, but I always go back to grasslands, which is what I worked on all my life and where I was brought up. I mean, one of the things, I mean, moving on a bit, one of the things we ask you to do is select 12 papers, which will make up a blog in the Journal of Ecology. And you provided us with 12 of the papers that you published in the journal. And I guess maybe this is an unfair question, but you know, which of those papers would you say is your favorite, and why, assuming there is one?
Well, so I have to say that I can't not mention that the first paper I have ever published in 1999 was in the Journal of Ecology. And I have to say that it might have not been the most influential, but it was the product of my first year of graduate school, where trying to design something so I could just like get to know some different systems. And looking back, I was like, how fortunate was I that I was able to do a first year, you know, a first summer research and actually be able to ask a question that was publishable, and that it has been helpful to other people. So I have to say that that paper with Deborah Goldberg and I is one that I always am just really feel fortunate for. And then also that the review process was so positive and supportive that it definitely made me feel like just really kind of that is the idea about putting together a project from start all the way to publication was a thing that I like to do. So, and then the other couple that I would say are special to me. I guess you just said one, but there's some that I work in large working groups for that we publish in Journal of Ecology, but there are also several that are published that are products of a graduate student that I advised, and some of them kind of were the first paper in their careers to really establish. Two of those, just to call out, is there's a paper that was led by Marco Spaciovic about traits and how the trait relationships related to over a productivity gradient. That was one that we worked really hard on trying to hone the questions on, and was a really important paper to send him on his research trajectory, but also has been very widely used in the functional trait work.
Great, yeah. And I mean, I guess moving on to more present, I mean, you talked about one of your first ever papers that you published in the journal, but I mean, one of the things that I think it's fair to say a key motivation of yours is to do what you call usable science, so addressing societal challenges, ecosystem restoration, for example, and resilience. And I guess I just sort of generally ask, you know, why you have chosen to do that, because I guess it's always a balance between fundamental science and the more applied stuff. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about your motivation for actually doing that.
I feel that just absolutely basic science and testing theory is a core priority, and certainly all the papers in the that I published in journal Ecology have that bent to it. But I also think that for those tests to actually matter, and that you can apply them, that you also can take those conceptual frameworks and say, well, how does this affect what we actually do? So going from theory to trying to apply that and actually working with partners that are not in academics, and then trying to translate that to on the ground application seems like a key way of bringing theory to test it, but then also to use it. And so I find all those parts very, very important, and also just very, very rewarding in many ways. There definitely have been times where I get into the really quantitative tests of theory, and then realize that any data that you're taking, like let's say for monitoring of different kind of managed areas or something, like no way could you have the resolution to be able to know that those processes are really important, in the actual dynamics of the system. But there's a lot of times where that connection is super, super important and super helpful to both thinking about how we apply the concepts, but then also super helpful for the people on the ground who are trying to make sense about why some systems act as they do and some systems don't. And so I found that to be probably the kind of the biggest success when that actually happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, could you give us an example, for example, current things that you're currently working on where you've been able to do that successfully?
Right. Yeah. So I guess one example that we've been working on in several different systems is the idea about when there are feedbacks in the system that actually affect the dynamics and maybe can cause some rapid change, or some actually seemingly pretty resilient systems. I've been focusing mostly on feedbacks between plants and soils. And we do find that there are many times where those feedbacks are really important to think about in terms of managing a system, and also trying to think about how can you kind of push the system to go in a direction that maybe is desirable from a human perspective. I guess one example of that is that we know that some plant species can establish under different resource conditions, but once they're established, they can change those resource conditions and also actually foster different microbial communities that then allow them to persist even if we start pushing the system through climate change or resource inputs, and that those systems, once intact, can be fairly resilient. And I think that is also an example that really, when you talk about it to managers, it makes a lot of sense to them.
Yeah. I was going to say, because one of the sort of challenges I guess we all face when we're trying to translate scientific knowledge into management or practice is, how do we effectively do that? And often our scientific discoveries are very context dependent, for example. And I just wondered if the particular, I guess, challenges that you've had to deal with in terms of transferring that evidence to actual policy or management.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that comes up a lot and does weigh on me is when just the multiple forms of knowledge that we use to make decisions, management policy decisions, and that, the scientific kind of quantitative data-based evidence is only one of many.
Yeah.
And sometimes we will do an experiment that's super complicated. There are results that are consistent with what's happening in terms of the larger patterns, but that we really have to be very careful about how we manipulate things and how we measure things. And then you work alongside a manager, a partner, and you do all that work and you get to that conclusion, and they kind of already know it because they've just worked in that place for so long. They're like, yeah, just because of that knowledge, that place-based knowledge, and that understanding about what happens in different years, for instance, and stuff. And so I think the biggest thing on my mind now is, how do you kind of integrate that, right? That certainly we need to do really robust experimental tests, but then we also need to give nods to these other types of knowledge that are maybe as or more useful in many, many cases. And so when do we integrate those? And when are there like intermediate points? Like right now I'm interested in a lot about how can we better use monitoring data. So not as process-based as an experimental based work, but that there's a lot of that information out there, and how can that be used for inference to basically bolster, so we don't have to tell policy or managers that we have to do, let's say, really complicated experiments in every single situation with every single environmental driver or climate change factor in order to be able to be helpful. So those are the types of context dependencies that I'm thinking about right now in terms of how to proceed to be useful on all those different types of information that we have available for our use, and which ones can we use better.
Yeah, I know one of the things you touched on before was about concepts in ecology, and I know it's something you've talked about, for example, in your MacArthur Award talk, about how we need to reevaluate some of these concepts. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, about how we can reevaluate things like resilience, for example, to make it more usable for practitioners and land managers.
I think one thing that is on the mind of lots of people, and certainly ecologists as well as managers, for instance, is the idea of, that climate change is occurring right now, right? So we're things are changing, things are not at equilibrium, right? We don't expect them to be. There are substantial lags in terms of what patterns we're seeing now and where the drivers are, for instance. It's just an example. Mm-hmm. And so we can absolutely draw some of the concepts that we have developed over the last several decades: coexistence, succession, resilience, right, to those ideas. But we have to also be cognizant that some of the absolute tests of those, particularly related to, being equilibrium, or what is stability, what those kind of things, I think we should ask whether, what is the most appropriate tests of those, and whether we should actually loosen some of the theoretical, let's say, constraints on those concepts, because how do we expect things to be stable? Do we expect change going forward? And should we be thinking about many of these things in a much more dynamic system, in terms of being able to take a process and think about the mechanism for that, but then also related to patterns that are actually occurring in the natural systems now. And so I think that's probably one example that I would say is an example that we're certainly we need to definitely use all the concepts and theories that have been developed over many decades in ecology, but things are different now in terms of how we're thinking about the world and change and trajectories. And I think that's where we really need to ask questions on both ends, right? On the what is applicable end, but also how maybe theory can be kind of adjusted a little bit to be more testable in what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of related topic as well is I guess people's wider interest in the environment and communicating with people about these kind of concepts and about why it's important to conserve and protect the natural world. And I might embarrass you here, but I saw a TED talk that you gave where you talked about curiosity starting in the backyard. And I think one of the things you highlighted was about how, well, the fact that relatively few people are actually interested in the natural world, and some of them think they should be, but fundamentally they're not. And I just wondered, again, if you could just say a bit more about how you are trying to address this, and also more broadly, you know, what can plant ecologists or ecologists in general do to address this kind of issue?
Well, that's a big question. I think that, but I do feel pretty strongly that when we're trying to convey what it is to do science, to be a scientist. So my experience, I grew up with a scientist in the house. So I could see the process at least a little bit, and the kind of discovery or how it was done. But if you are not that type of person, the first thing we do to introduce people to many forms of science is we put them in a huge lecture hall and we give them a lot of information, and we basically convey that to be a good scientist, you have to memorize very well, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel pretty strongly, and we certainly are studying this and trying to put programs in place to maybe change this. And a lot of other people are too, for sure. But that, why not start with actually asking a question that no one knows? And let's start figuring it out. I mean, isn't that why everyone loves to be an ecologist, right? Is that there's these questions that are super cool, super interesting, and then it's like, let's be curious, let's be creative, and let's try to figure out what's happening. And so that is totally different than memorizing concepts. And you're out there, you're observing, you're asking why, you're trying to use data to try to learn something that then can kind of iterate to ask the second type of question and the third. And so thinking about that is where I would like to bring people in. Yeah. I think we would widen that umbrella in a way that would be very, very beneficial to science, to ecology, but also just to allow people more of a idea that you don't have to be this kind of elite, you have to know all this stuff to be able to ask these questions and actually kind of learn about things, even if it's just observing something that's going on, behind your house or something like that. It's still incredibly interesting, but then also very useful too. So I'm doing that with a project about apple trees in Colorado, where we're bringing in students early on to ask questions about the historic apple trees in the region. We're expanding to a whole suite of community colleges across the state in order to diversify and actually get people really early on and seeing how that might help just make maybe a broader set of people identify as maybe scientists. And then also the idea that doing a lot of those things in a place that right? So locally, And so having that place-based knowledge is, I think makes that foundation more inclusive.
I mean, my impression is more people are becoming interested in ecology more generally. I'm sure there's an awful lot that can be done, but generally they are, even in soils, which I find fantastic. And I guess my next question relates to I guess what advice would you give people who were wanting to enter the field of ecology? So if you've met a young scientist at university or school who was saying they wanted to do a similar job to you, I mean, what kind of advice do you think you would give them to help them on their way?
Well, I'd absolutely say go for it, and it's a great career and profession.
Mm-hmm.
I would say this, first of all, just take as many experiences as you can, to go out with different people and just see how different aspects of research happen. That could be doing independent research projects as an undergrad, but it sometimes maybe not, maybe actually being part of a team and actually contributing to a team and seeing how to get and getting trained and learning kind of approaches and philosophies, not totally by yourself, maybe a mix. And then really going with what you're really just keenly interested in, even if that interest, you can't necessarily justify it for any necessarily scientific reason or something. But if you really, really love something, I think that's a very good reason to study it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my last question actually is, if you were to start again, would you follow the same path that you have, or would you do something different?
I've been incredibly fortunate, and I think about the paths and where I've been able to, who I've been able to work with, and some of it absolute luck, but I feel very fortunate on how I have been able to do what I have wanted to do. I think if I was going to do it again, I would perhaps invest a little more in accumulating experiences before I went to graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
I had graduated from undergrad and I decided just to apply straight on to graduate school. I needed a job. I couldn't just like travel for a year or something like that. And I was pretty sure that I wanted to go to graduate school. So my logic was like, well, then go, right? And I think about how I would have developed if I had accumulated more diverse set of experiences early on. And even the experiences that if I could have told myself that would have been really good, would have been working more with nonprofits and policy, maybe some international efforts to basically see how science could be used by all of those kind of different types of groups, and then go in. I think that would have helped. Maybe not where I decided to go, but that kind of commitment that what I'm doing, I could see where the endpoint might be, and that I could make sure that was a solid pathway.
Yeah, and careers are very long, really. I mean, I look back at my career, it's actually a long time, and there is a lot of opportunity to do different things, and hopefully growing awareness of the importance of those different experiences in enriching people's careers. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and finally, many congratulations again on your
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.